Thank you for coming to the February meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club. We're glad you're here. There are snacks if you'd like to help yourself at some point. Please do so. And there's also the sign-up list for the email information for the Socratic Club. So if you'd like to keep apprised of what we do when we do it, please sign up. The Gonzaga Socratic Club was founded a little over 5 years ago, and our raison d'etre is to explore questions in the Christian worldview from a philosophical perspective. We take our inspiration and our name even from the Oxford Socratic Club that was presided over by famous Christian apologist C.S. Lewis. And the motto of the Oxford Socratic Club was to follow the argument wherever it leads. And that means that we are fundamentally open to critical exploration and thinking about Christian worldview issues with a completely open mind. We try to do that. Today we're going to be talking about science and, to a certain extent, religion and philosophy as well. We live in a science and technology obsessed age. After only a few short decades of using computers, the internet, cell phones, and now tablets, smartphones, and social media, few of us can imagine life without these tools and resources, even if we decry effects they have on concrete human relationships and our patterns of thinking and acting. So I'm not a Luddite, but I'm a critic. One implication of the social success and domination of science and technology is that they have an almost magic, talismanic force in establishing what things are good and valuable in our culture. We see this in the widespread modern practice of anthropomorphizing science as an agent in its own right, in phrases like, science teaches us, science says, fill in the blank, as we all know from science. The reputational glory of science can also have negative uses. It has been so put to use, for example, to discredit other human pursuits. Consider a simple argument here. Try to follow along with me. I could write it on the board, but I think you guys will follow this. Science is enormously successful in finding truths about the world we live in. Other approaches to finding truths about our world, literature, religion, history, philosophy, are not nearly so successful or precise as science is. Therefore, conclusion, science through the scientific method is the only trustworthy means of finding truths. The view in this conclusion, labeled scientism by critics, seems to be a simple conceptual extension from the success of science. Should we take it seriously? Or consider a related argument. Science shows us that the only subject matter about which we can have firm and concrete knowledge is the natural sphere accessible to us via sense perception. In practical terms, therefore, the only reality is that reality about which we can have firm and concrete knowledge. So, conclusion, in practical terms, the only reality is that the natural, that which is knowable by sense perception, is real. So by a pair of simple syllogisms, we move from the success of science to scientism on the one hand, and from the power of scientific method to naturalism on the other hand. While I hope that people, at least people here, gathered in this room today, with the basic knowledge of critical thinking possessed by the average Gonzaga undergraduate, could raise telling objections to either of these arguments, there's no doubt that they capture intuitions held by many modern Westerners and encapsulate arguments many leading cultural figures are prepared to make. Our speaker today hopes to address this topic and arguments like those I've just briefly sketched out by exploring how the practices and methods of science are put forward as criteria to judge the inferiority of religion, philosophy, and other human cultural pursuits. Brent Diebel is an instructor in the Gonzaga Philosophy Department. He completed his MA degree in philosophy from Gonzaga last year with a thesis on science and philosophy of mind titled Intertheoretic Relation, Reduction, and a defense of the legitimacy of mental discourse in the sciences. Please welcome Brent to the Socratic Club.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you everyone for coming on this wonderfully sort of sunny Spokane Friday. I must say, if you could start passing that around, I only copied 45, and I don't know how many are here, so hopefully you might have to share. We'll make this kind of a communal activity. And I must say also, David's topic today is prescient, since just last night Richard Dawkins was having an interview with Rowan Atkinson, or not Rowan Atkinson, that would be Mr. Bean, but rather the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Mr. Bean reference already in the first minute. But nevertheless, Dr. Anthony Kenny was moderating this debate. And Dawkins admitted that he wasn't completely sure that God didn't exist. He has a 7-point scale, and evidently he's sitting at about a 6.9 on the probability that God doesn't indeed exist. Of course, Anthony Kenny then commented, well, Richard, why don't you call yourself an agnostic? And Dawkins said, well, I more or less do, in which case Anthony Kenny said, you're known as the world's most famous atheist. Okay, so given that here, I don't want to make a straw Dawkins argument here. On the handout here, I have Dawkins representing atheism for us, because for all intents and purposes in his writings, he is an atheist par excellence. So I want to use him as an example of atheism and the way that we might approach science in this regard. So what I hope to do is briefly sketch out my position here, and then thanks to David's helpful comments, generate some discussion. We've got a large group here, and I'm sure you all have something interesting to say and want to add. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So let's proceed. So tonight I would like to start with what I will not attempt in this presentation. First, I will not be giving anything like a comprehensive and nuanced explication of science, or specifically the contemporary understanding of science, other than a few brief observations about its methods, its goals, and how certain popular writers like Richard Dawkins seem to understand what science does, and indeed what it can do. The prefatory remarks by Dr. Calhoun help us in this regard. Second, I will not be outlining an argument for the truth of theism or atheism, then defending said arguments against possible criticisms. Perhaps we can discuss this during the question and answer time. And I will conclude with some brief remarks about the prospects of theistic arguments in light of the distinctions I hope to clarify here. Rather, my intention is to show that the common disjunctions, those of faith versus reason and religion versus science, that characterize the contemporary debates about theism and atheism, are problematic and misleading. I will suggest that a more adequate framing of the debate is the relationship of philosophical inquiry to scientific investigation. And I maintain that the fundamental issue is actually prima facie, for lack of a better term, a reason versus reason debate here. That is, given a certain conception of what science is and how it should be practiced, traditional philosophical inquiry into the nature of reality is, as a matter of course, oftentimes truncated and then diminished. And since Christianity, perhaps to a greater or lesser degree Judaism and Islam, include metaphysical components, statements about material and spiritual realities, rational investigation into them, even as preambles to the faith, to use Aquinas' phrase, will be either impugned or ignored altogether. Thus, belief in God is relegated to the subjective personal experience, merely willed belief, or even worse, plain old irrationality. So, let me set this up. I'm going to briefly give a view of science and religion here. So in order to situate this discussion on science and philosophy, it's helpful to take a brief look at the conception of science, and this bears some investigation. It will be helpful to look at two somewhat lengthy quotes that summarize the stance towards science nicely. And this is what are on, both of these are on your handout here. The first is from a speech given by Richard Dawkins after acceptance of Humanist of the Year in 1996. The speech was on the topic of whether or not science is indeed a religion here. And I want to make this caveat. We're talking about Dawkins' understanding of science. Okay? So Dawkins says the following. It bears reading. It's wonderfully Dawkinsian. Science, then, is free of the main vice of religion, which is faith. But as I pointed out, science does have some of religion's virtues. Religion may aspire to provide its followers with various benefits, among them explanation, consolation, and uplift. Science, too, has something to offer in these areas. Humans have a great hunger for explanation, and may be one of the main reasons why humanity so universally has religion, since religions do aspire to provide explanations. We come to our individual consciousness in a mysterious universe and long to understand it. And then these bolds are actually mine. Most religions offer a cosmology and a biology, a theory of life, a theory of origins, and reasons for existence. In doing so, they demonstrate that religion is, in a sense, science. It's just bad science. Don't fall for the argument that religion and science operate on separate dimensions and are concerned with quite separate sorts of questions. Religions have historically always attempted to answer the questions that properly belong to science. Thus, religions should not be allowed to retreat from the ground upon which they have traditionally attempted to fight. They do offer both a cosmology and a biology. However, in both cases, it is false. Consolation is harder for science to provide. Unlike religion, science cannot offer the bereaved a glorious reunion with their loved ones in the hereafter. Those wronged on this earth cannot, on a scientific view, anticipate a sweet comeuppance for their tormentors in a life to come. It could be argued that if the idea of an afterlife is an illusion, as I believe it is, the consolation it offers is hollow. But that's not necessarily so. A false belief can be just as comforting as a true one, provided the believer never discovers its falsity. But if consolation comes that cheap, science can weigh in with other cheap palliatives, such as pain-killing drugs, whose comfort may or may not be illusory, but they do work. Uplift, however, is where science really comes into its own. All the great religions have a place for awe, for ecstatic transport at the wonder and beauty of creation. And it's exactly this feeling of spine-shivering, breath-catching awe, almost worship, this flooding of the chest with ecstatic wonder that modern science can provide. And it does so beyond the wildest dreams of saints and mystics. The fact that the supernatural has no place in our explanations, in our understanding of so much of the universe and life, doesn't diminish the awe. Quite the contrary. The merest glance through a microscope at the brain of an ant, or through a telescope at a long-ago galaxy of 1 billion worlds, is enough to render pokey and parochial the very psalms of praise. Those are beautifully written. Notice here, though, that Dawkins' assertion that both science and religion attempt to answer the same questions about cosmology and biology, and religion's answers just happen to be false. Notice also that the supernatural has no place in explanations. Now, on to the second quote. John Dickel, a philosopher at the University of Cincinnati, says the following. One feature of my new wave meta-science deserves explicit discussion. It eschews all traditional concern with ontology and metaphysics, even with the secondary derivative sense I advocated in my 1998 book. There, my guiding intuition was that science is the best method we have for doing ontology, for constructing informationally rich representations of a real world assumed to exist independently of our representing it. I assumed that neuroscience is doing just fine by ignoring philosophical objections to psychoneural reduction and proceeding instead in the fashion I tried to capture within New Wave reductionism. I was urging that we accept science's strategy to core. Trust scientific practice and let ontological chips fall where they may. However, I've come to see even that project as too metaphysical. Even though scientists talk a realistic sounding language, We should not interpret this talk as addressing questions external to the practice and concerns of a given scientific endeavor. The job of New Wave Metascience, which sounds more like a music movement than a scientific movement, nevertheless, in metascience is simply to illuminate concepts like reduction as they imbue actual scientific practice. To what end? Not to achieve some better way of addressing and reformulating external questions about the existence and nature of theory-independent ontology. Rather, because a reasonable explanatory goal is to understand the practices internal to important current scientific endeavors and the scope of their potential application and development. Now, the quotes are quite lengthy, but we'll return to them a number of times. Bickel's statement requires some explanation. Bickel's usage of internal and external are derived from Rudolf Carnap. In Bickel's earlier work, he espoused a theory-first, ontology-second approach to science and metaphysics. That is, given the way that theories are related, or were related, say theories about brain events and theories about mind events, one could draw ontological conclusions about the way the world actually is. E.g., in his case, there are no mind events, only brain events. In his more recent work, however, he's not interested in ontological questions at all. Carnap's internal-external distinction helps make sense of this. Internal questions for Carnap are questions that can be answered from within a linguistic framework, whereas external questions are questions about the actual existence of this framework system as a whole. So Carnap's example is that once one accepts thing language, one can ask questions about whether there are papers on the desk, whether King Arthur lived, etc. These are the sorts of questions that can be answered by empirical investigation by Carnap's lights. External questions about the metaphysical standing of such objects as chairs, anything else pretty much, cannot be asked from within the accepted linguistic framework. Scientists ask the former sorts of questions. Philosophers ask the latter sorts of questions. Now, aware of Quine's serious objection to this line of reasoning, Bickel writes the following. New Wave metascience isn't merely old-fashioned logical positivism rediscovered. New Wave metascience doesn't treat traditional ontological questions as cognitively meaningless, just pointless to pursue as serious intellectual work because they amount to nothing more than disagreements over bare intuitions, with no agreed-upon evidence for resolving them. He continues with a key statement. Relevant evidence is straightforward for questions internal to scientific practices. What experiments are being pursued, which results are being published in the best journals, which researchers asking which questions are getting funded, who is winning the most prestigious awards. The ontological questions, however, even when reformulated using resources from philosophy of science and the relevant sciences, remain as fruitless as ever. So, there are some important dissimilarities in what Dawkins and Bickel are claiming. Dawkins clearly thinks that scientific discovery has ontological import, that science is about the best or only method for discovering what is. So at least in this respect, Dawkins is a realist, a scientific realist. And being rational is accepting the methods of investigation and the conclusions of those investigations. To accept something else would make one a person of faith. Bickel, on the other hand, is not so quick to make the same move about ontology. Science is a matter of systems of representation and models, of which we can say very little as to the actual existence of the posits of these systems. Justification for such an approach is largely pragmatic, but Bickel admits that if one is going to be a realist, scientific realism is really the only game in town. But external questions, if they should arrive at all, should actually be ignored. Practically speaking, however, Dawkins and Bickel's positions are significantly similar in an important respect. The only sorts of issues that can be answered are those that arise within scientific practice and methodology. Science, as scientists practice it, is the only sufficient way of answering questions of any real importance. So that's even though we might have a pragmatic approach and a realist approach, they both converge on just this issue here. The science is the way to find out the way the world is, if we can even know what the world is. Okay. So, but what about traditional issues of philosophy? questions about how knowledge is possible at all, whether there are universals, whether God exists, whether there is a soul and what its nature is, what the good life consists of. Given the power science has, does philosophy have a role here? Bickle more or less offers two alternatives. Philosophers can continue to try and carve a niche for themselves in their projects and they run the risk of irrelevancy, or they can concentrate on the philosophy of science. In other words, philosophers are left to justify their own existence given the power of scientific investigation and the discipline itself. So the philosopher's job is to be a referee of sorts, whose primary task is the clarification and refinement of concepts used within scientific endeavors. For example, Bickle's task in Philosophy and Neuroscience, which is the work I pulled this quote from, is not to give a philosophical account of reduction per se, and he's thinking of neuroscience here, but instead to show how reduction is done in actual scientific practice. Seen this way, the philosopher does the hermeneutics of science, and as the interpreter of scientific findings, who may yet work out the implications of the scientific findings while discovering interesting connections between the disciplines. And as the quote above indicates, this may include the philosopher doing a fair amount of the sociology of science. Although Dawkins is indeed a scientific realist, it is difficult to see if philosophy can really have any other role for him either. You want to go to the truth, you want to find the truth, you go to the lab coats. Right? I mean, that's a rather coarse way of putting it. But it's the kind of idea you have. And if you want to have a job, you talk about what exactly they're doing when they're acting in the role of the lab coat. Now, Alistair McIntyre succinctly summarizes the scientific endeavor in the following way. Once again, I want to make the distinction. I mean, this is how Dawkins and Bickle understand science. It's a slightly different conception than we might say the traditional understanding of science, but bear with me here. So, Alistair McIntyre summarizing scientific endeavor in the following way. What natural scientific investigations enable us to explain is how finite beings have come to be, what they are now, and how they will come to be what they will be. Such investigations begin from the recognition that some particular type of cause has produced some particular type of effect, and are then asking how on earth indeed, we are to explain why and how such effects issue from such causes. The answer will be a more fundamental story of causal sequences that in turn invite explanation at a still more fundamental level. Accordingly, at each level of explanation, one will be able to ask and answer the question of what and how something took place. So let us return to Dawkins' quote above, specifically the text in bold. So given the way that Alistair McIntyre understands what scientific endeavor is, Dawkins explicitly states that supernatural reasons have no place in scientific explanation. This is confirmed again in The Blind Watchmaker when he explicates the mode of explanation proper to scientific investigation, which is, of course, reductive explanation. Similar to Bickle, his suggestion is that we follow the scientist's lead in this matter. There's an important distinction to make at this juncture, as Dawkins could be making one of two different sorts of claims. Let us assume that Dawkins is making a claim about the method that science should adopt in order to explain a given phenomenon. If this is the case, then Dawkins is specifying what is going to count as a scientific investigation. And in these accounts cannot properly appeal to God's activity, angels, non-physical entities, etc. Understood this way, one has a set of data, as it were, that which is to be explained, constraints on the theory's parameters, and the evidence set, which includes assumptions about the nature of the world, logic, math, etc., etc. This is what is sometimes referred to as methodological naturalism. Neither the data nor the evidence set will include reference to God or any other supernatural entity. If it does, by Dawkins' light, we're just not doing science anymore. Now, there might be reasons to adopt methodological naturalism and decompositional analysis, which is kind of a correlate of it, as it were. For example, William Wimsatt discusses it as a heuristic, or as a specific kind of problem-solving tactic used in specific contexts. He writes, now I quote this, "These tactics were not derived directly from a theoretical understanding of the solution space, but were informal rules of thumb, derived perhaps from a partial theoretical understanding, or perhaps which were known only empirically to work often enough to make them worth trying." That is, these decompositional sorts of approaches to phenomena. Okay? And he continues by listing 6 common properties of heuristics, these rules of thumbs that we use to do this kind of analysis and explanation. So briefly, heuristics do these things. They don't necessarily guarantee that they will produce a solution or a correct solution to whatever problem or puzzle that's been generated by the phenomenon. They are more cost-effective in terms of resources they use, memory, computation, that sort of thing, at least in comparison to other procedures that could be used. They produce errors that are systematically biased, and we can account for that. That is, a heuristic thought of as a kind of mechanism, and understanding how this mechanism works allows one to predict when the heuristic, or this rule of thumb, will break down. They transform the problem into a non-equivalent but intuitively related problem. And they are purpose relative and are designed to work in certain applications in a relatively unbiased manner. But in other situations, they may be more biased. Finally, they are often successors of other heuristics, often modified or differentially specialized to work better in different environments. So what's the point of saying all of this? Well, the important issue is that there may be justifications, theoretical or pragmatic, for approaching explanations in this manner. But their justification is philosophical in nature, especially with regard to the evidence set. Science involves all sorts of assumptions. There is a physical world existing independently of one's mind, that this world is characterized by objective patterns and regularities. Our senses are at least partially reliable sources of information about the world. There are objective laws of logic and mathematics that apply to the objective world. Our cognitive powers, concept formation, reasoning from premises to conclusions, etc., allow one to grasp the laws and can take one from evidence derived from senses to conclusions about the physical world. That language can adequately express truths about these laws and about the external world, etc. The point? Each of these are metaphysical assumptions that are used in order to do science itself. To use science to justify them would be flatly circular. And methodological naturalism is conceptually problematic at any rate. As I've argued elsewhere, there may be situations in which a set of concepts are necessary precisely because they make phenomena intelligible and cannot be reduced to any more basic set of concepts. So, we're clear on the methodological naturalism. It's a constraint on what is going to count as a scientific theory itself. Okay? It's an epistemic point, not necessarily an ontological point. But perhaps Dawkins' claim is the ontological claim. That is, perhaps he's not talking about adequate representational structures or theories, but about real-world items, the furniture that make up the world. This would mean that the universe consists merely of matter and motion and their relations, straightforward naturalism. The ontological claim may motivate the epistemic claim above, but nevertheless, if he's making the ontological claim, then it falls prey to a similar set of difficulties. Many, including Alvin Plantinga, C.S. Lewis, Richard Taylor, and others, have argued that belief in naturalism coupled with a belief in evolution, which is Dawkins' primary mode of explanation of biological entities and whatnot, is actually self-defeating. And we could certainly review the argument here. But for my present purposes, it's enough to say that there is a much more complex relationship between philosophy and science, or at least this kind of common conception of scientific investigation. What I hope this all suggests is that there are interesting philosophical questions and concerns generated by a systematic investigation into the world itself. What may be required is not just a philosophy of science, as it is variously understood, ranging from sociology of science to this kind of hermeneutical approach, but also a philosophy of nature itself. And this will include a metaphysics or a description of reality that is more basic and general than any particular scientific theory. Science already makes assumptions, and I think this is an aspect that bears an investigation. Also, many of the traditional arguments for God's existence, in particular those not inspired by William Paley, and these are the ones I'm talking about right now, attempt to demonstrate God's existence using a conception of nature that must be understood and evaluated in its own right. That is, many of these traditional sorts of arguments for God's existence assume a picture of nature or a philosophy of nature. And I would like to conclude with a few remarks on wonder, questioning, and explanation just in general. As Aristotle famously stated, philosophy starts with wonder. Human experience generates puzzles. Why questions are formulated and explanations are offered to understand it or to answer these why sorts of questions. In multiple places, including the quote in your possession, Dawkins expresses just this kind of wonder at the natural world. Speaking in the Scientific American to a fellow atheist scientist, Dawkins says the following. And so they're talking about Carl Sagan. Many of you won't even know who that is. He was big on PBS back in the 1980s. He had a wonderful voice. But he said, so they're having this conversation, Dawkins and this other professor of physics by the name of Krauss. And he says, yes, this is Dawkins speaking. Yes, I love that sentiment of Sagan's. And the sentiment was mentioned earlier, and it's the sentiment that standard religious wonder is in fact too myopic, too limited. A single world is too puny for a real God. The vast scope of our universe revealed to us by science is far grander. Okay, so this is the sentiment they're talking about. So he says, yes, I love that sentiment of Sagan's. And I'm so glad you picked it out. I summed it up for the publishers of those lectures on the book jacket. Was Carl Sagan a religious man? He was so much more than a religious man. He left behind the petty parochial medieval world of the conventionally religious. Left the theologians, priests, and mullahs wallowing in their small-minded spiritual poverty. He left them behind because he had so much more to be religious about. They have their Bronze Age myths, medieval superstitions, and childish wishful thinking. He had the universe. I don't think there's anything I can add in answering your question about whether science can enrich faith. It can in the sense you and Sagan mean, but I hate to be misunderstood as endorsing faith. So that's the end of Dawkins' quote there. What's interesting is the language used here. The scientist is, for all intents and purposes, smitten with the cosmos. And the cosmos is revealed by science in deeper and more fundamental ways. And the scientist's stance is to ask the questions to deliver the ultimate sorts of explanations. Elsewhere in this piece, another telling dialogue takes place. So Krauss, his interlocutor, says the following. For me, it's a matter of ignoring add-ons rather than being nice to them, because I don't see any debate as being fruitful. Going back to my earlier point, if this realm was restricted to religion alone, one might have a good argument for trying to squelch religion. But like it or not, it's a central facet of much of what it means to be human. And by add-ons, he means, as far as explanation is concerned, the religious tend to just tack God on as kind of ancillary to this whole process. Okay, we just want to keep this notion of God in here somewhere. So, but like it or not, it's a central facet of much of what it means to be a human. All of us share some characteristics with Lewis Carroll's Queen, who believed 6 impossible things before breakfast each day. For most people, religion is one way of making sense of an irrational world, a world that is not fair, in which human justice is an afterthought. Dawkins fairly bristles at this. If it's a central facet of what it means to be human, so much the worse for humans, says Dawkins. The world is not irrational. The world may be unfair, but it is not irrational. The rational response to an unfair world is to recognize that we have no right to expect it to be fair. If that sounds callous, I'm sorry, but it is the business of science to understand the way the world is, not to try to derive comfort from it. Dawkins assumes that the world is indeed rational and intelligent. The human mind can come to know it. But what about this fact about the universe? Does it call out for explanation too? McIntyre points out that the atheist resorts to the "this is just how it is" response. But that's not a scientific way of answering the question, since if that had been the answer given long ago in the history of scientific inquiry, science as an enterprise would have never occurred. Is there a reason to stop the inquiry at this point now? Of course, the answer to this question would require one to talk about the regularities of the universe, the purposive structure inherent in things, and what would be necessary for this to be the case. And we know where that may lead. Thank you.
It's the normal practice of the Socratic Club to have a commentator. I'm afraid this month I was disorganized enough that I had to appoint myself as the commentator. So I just want to make a couple of what I hope to be expository question-raising comments about Mr. Diebel's presentation. As he suggested, and as I talked about in my opening remarks, what we might call the argument from science proceeds from the success of science to various claims about what is valuable, about what is true about the world, or ultimately what's real, or indeed what can be known. So I purposely, if you notice the move I just made, those are the three traditional branches of philosophy: ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, or the theory of how we ought to act, the theory about what's real, and the theory about what we can know. And so the argument from science typically proceeds as an argument from the success of science to questions about what is valuable, what is real, and what can be known. However, as I take it, Mr. Diebel's argument runs something like this. Any such argument from science is not a scientific argument. It's by definition a philosophical argument. And indeed, in the way I've just tried to sketch it out, I think you can see that. If it deals with entities that we're going to say are the typical or traditional field of philosophical inquiry, then the argument itself is philosophical. Further, it's important that this argument is not merely an argument from the philosophy of science, which Mr. Diebel pointed out in some cases. Critics such as Bickel are willing to say there's a role for the philosophy of science. If you philosophers have to occupy yourselves somehow, what you can do is talk about the concepts, terms, and practices of science. But if Mr. Diebel's argument is successful, then what he suggested is that any such argument that proceeds from science to claims about what is valuable, what is real, or what is true, or what can be known, that's doing more than philosophy of science. That's raising philosophical questions at a much deeper level. This means, if I can actually extend the way you've put your argument, Mr. Diebel, this means that science inevitably points beyond itself to other disciplines, or practices and arguments in sciences, we might put it another way, lead us inevitably to investigation that breaks the bounds of systematic theorizing using naturalistic tools about the natural world, which is a definition of science. And I like particularly how you put that in terms of Aristotle's idea of wonder. A scientist who is awake to his own practices is aware that there are greater things in life than science, we might say. You would expect that from philosophers, however. So, and I think it's also important, the final example that you gave us of that is this very puzzling intelligibility of the world. Science, as a practice, succeeds only on the assumption that the universe is intelligible and accessible to theorizing and explanation. And yet, it seems we would want to ask if we're really going to be, in a way, you're turning the scientist on himself here in this last point of your argument, because if we're really going to adopt scientific curiosity, Surely we should ask the why question. We should have that fascination of Aristotle, that wonder about that very fact. Why is it that the universe can be known? Why is it that it's possible to offer intelligible explanations of natural phenomena? I was just reading for my Christianity and Science class the other day. We read an excerpt from Wilson's Consilience, in which at one point he makes the comment, and I hadn't talked to Mr. Diebel yet, those of you who are in my class. So when I emphasized this in our class, I didn't know this is what he was going to talk about. But Wilson comments on the fortunate intelligibility of the universe. Isn't that amazing? Aren't we lucky the universe is intelligible? Well, as Mr. Diebel points out, it seems like a scientist would want to ask, why the hell is it that the universe is intelligible? How is it that we're able to know the universe? But that's a question that's going to lead us beyond science. Thank you. Mr. Diebel, would you like to respond? And then we'll open up for questions here.
Thank you, David, for those helpful comments. It was serendipitous, I suppose, that we converged on this point at the end. I intentionally left the religious aspect out of this because I fear that when individuals like Dawkins tend to talk about religion, it's a rather loaded terms. If you take religion as being defined by maybe the 3 C's, a creed, a code, and a cult, the beliefs, the ways of worship, and the way that one should act. Okay? If we take that understanding, religion typically includes this belief in God. And so what I wanted to do, what my intention was, is to show more along these lines that science tends to point away from itself to these more basic kind of metaphysical questions, and that the traditional arguments for God's existence require us to see it in this way, because if these arguments are intended to be preambles to faith in God, right? The rest of the 3 C's. Faith is going to be a rational enterprise because it's going to be on the basis of certain sorts of metaphysical sorts of arguments, or at least it's possible that it be the case. Religion is typically understood as kind of cordoned off from reason, but that's precisely what I don't want to appear as here. We need to work out something slightly more basic here, a fuller understanding of perhaps what science does indeed mean. So I would just go to add this comments, David.
Questions, please. Discussion.
Dr. Koch?
Well, I'd like to open up the question and answer session here with a very provocative question. Why is it that Master Diebel and Dr. Calhoun both insult philosophy? Why slings and arrows? Why philosophy, the unscientific?
Why conceive of philosophy as non-scientific, you're saying?
Not non-scientific, the term was unscientific. Both of you use that term.
I had to think for a moment because I was pretty sure I was on the side of philosophy and science here. So let me start.
I think you are.
Right. Very good.
Well, my question is provocative.
It is provocative. If by science we mean a rationally ordered body of knowledge, then I would say philosophy is scientific in that way, as is ethics and all sorts of other sorts of disciplines. So I hate to insult my own discipline. I don't want to have to be down in Las Vegas with a sign that says, out of work philosopher. But nevertheless, I wouldn't say it's unscientific in that way. I'm saying as it's typically understood. I don't know. That's my first salvo at the slings and arrows here.
Yeah, I would say, I was talking, if I said that, I'm not sure exactly which comment you're referring to, but as in the current understanding of what science is, of course, that's shorthand for natural science. That's the current understanding. And a philosopher doesn't have to acknowledge that, or doesn't have to agree that philosophy is unscientific in the classical sense of scientia, a form of knowing, if that's what you're getting at.
Well, actually what I'm getting at is, I'm trying to suggest that maybe the whole way in which the problem has been framed here is barking up the wrong tree. That's what I'm suggesting. In other words, rather than say, well, look, I mean, here you have these people who claim that science is everything, religion is just bad science, philosophy is wishful thinking, and so on and so forth, right? So you're Dawkins of the world. And you're presenting an argument against that view that suggests that, well, I mean, they get to the point of asking what you identify as philosophical questions, and they say those questions can't be asked, and that's an unscientific attitude. So the idea is that, that philosophy is in the realm of the unscientific.
Well, that's certainly not what I meant to suggest. I meant to suggest that science, natural science, let me be clear about this, natural science points to the wider question of scientia, of knowing. And there are questions about knowing that are addressed in the discipline that we call philosophy.
What wider questions? See, that's precisely what I'm getting at. I mean, perhaps another way of looking at this is there's the asking of questions and the attempt to answer that.
Sure.
Right? And the questions are answered when we come to some sort of settled knowledge. And what's science? Well, isn't science settled knowledge that answers questions? Isn't that the view that somebody like Dawkins and his friends are suggesting? And they're suggesting that, well, you know, there are all these other people who say they're not doing science and propose answers, and, well, they're just wrong. They're just, that's just bad science. And you're trying to then defend this bad science by saying, well, it's not bad science, it's just different from science. Is that what you're arguing?
That's not what I was arguing. I was arguing it's different from natural science.
Well, what's natural science then?
It's specifically knowledge that has to do with explaining events in nature.
Okay. But is that what Dawkins is talking about? So he's saying that you explained we can have science of nature, but we can't have science of other things. Is that what Dawkins is saying, according to your interpretation? See, it seems to me that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is there is no other science. There's just science. Yeah, you want to call it natural science, the science of nature. Okay, fine. But there isn't anything else to know. That's what he's saying.
Yes. Yeah, I'd agree with that too. Yes, that's what he is saying.
Yeah.
So the whole thing rests on whether there's anything beyond nature, right?
Okay.
And if there is, then perhaps there is a science of whatever is beyond nature or apart from nature. Right? But in any case, if there is a science, if there is something to know apart from nature, and there's a way of knowing it, then we have science. I mean, we haven't gone out of the realm of science. Now, we may have gone out of the realm of nature, but we haven't gone out of the realm
don't think we're disagreeing. I think that maybe I'm misunderstanding something here about what you're suggesting, but I take it this is what Brent was doing too. We're operating using the language that Dawkins is using, but pointing out that there are inadequacies both in the language that he's using and the concepts that are behind the language he's using. And it seems to me that's what you're arguing. And so
Yeah,
our disagreement isn't between the two of us and you, it's between the three of us and Dawkins, I would say. But
because I didn't want to suggest that those other things are things that could not be known, and therefore couldn't be a science.
No, I know you're not suggesting.
Yeah,
Right. Dawkins is suggesting that. He's the one who's
Sure.
suggesting that.
yeah.
And you're saying that that's an arbitrary cutoff point. And I grant you that. You know, I mean, just to say there is nothing to be known, therefore even attempts to know it is just, it's wishful thinking, it's something out of the realm of good, solid human knowing. Right? And that's got to be something like Dawkins'
Yeah.
position. And you're rightly pointing out, it seems to me, that that's an arbitrary cutoff point, to say that we can't ask a question about, well, you know, why should we accept that this is all that can be known about nature, namely that which the natural sciences tell us, or even whether or not the natural sciences in fact tell us more about nature than what Dawkins would say, would admit to.
Yeah, I think the latter is certainly true.
Yeah, see, what I'm suggesting is the barking up the wrong tree issue is I'm suggesting philosophy is not a discipline, right? So it's not like you have the natural sciences over here and you have philosophy over here, and each, you know, and each of them have their proper subject. Now, there aren't any philosophical questions apart from science questions. There are just questions of what is there to know and how do we go about knowing it? And those are questions that every intellectual discipline involves. So there are just sciences, and the sciences are distinguished according to their subject matter. So we can have life sciences because they're living things. We can have earth science because they're terrestrial things, or celestial sciences because there are stars and planets, etc. Right? Because there are different things to know, we have different sciences. But all the human knowledge is nothing but science. That's what I'm suggesting. And that perhaps the better way to frame the argument against Dawkins is to say, are you sure that you're allowing all the questions that can be raised in the natural sciences to be raised? So rather than saying, oh, stop denying that there are philosophical questions, admit, well, there aren't any specifically philosophical questions, as if philosophy is a separate discipline, a separate science. But rather to say, well, Professor Dawkins, have you, is your conception of human knowledge such that it allows all the questions that can be raised about natural things to be raised? And maybe, and I would say that the kind of argument, the sort of retorsive argument that you're presenting, suggests that he's not allowing it, and his failure to allow it is a mere arbitrary decision,
Right.
or what we would call a prejudgment, prejudice, in other words.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Okay.
Oh, I don't know, I was just gonna ask a different question. You guys still want to?
No,
No, it's okay.
yeah.
So I agree that like science can like point us to other fields, like you can use deductive reasoning to like even like develop like an ethics or like a better way to live out of like scientific knowledge, but I just don't see how using like that's a similar line of deductive reasoning could like point to a God eventually, you know, like I feel like that's a different, I feel like that's a big jump still, like even like with the claim that, you know, that science does point to other fields, but I don't know, where does the God part come in?
Okay, that's a fair enough question. Why I make the distinction between what I call traditional sorts of arguments, like a cosmological argument versus the Paley-inspired arguments. In which case, the sorts of arguments that Dawkins tends to engage are, quite frankly, the sorts of God of the gaps arguments. They're an inference to the best explanation of something. So we've got a lot of intelligent design has this sort of feature where we've got a complex phenomenon like the flagella, Michael Behe's flagella, and so you have this, and it's a matter of explaining. It's trying to explain how it came to be what it is, and so the Paley sort of argument here is you take these kinds of complexities, irreducible complexities, you must argue, and say, well, the resources of natural selection, there aren't enough resources in natural selection to get us to this level of complexity. So there must be some other explanation. So that would be kind of inductive argument, right? So it's likely that we had some other sort of finger come down and do the business, right? So that would be the kind of inductive argument. But as best I understand the traditional, the kind of cosmological sort of argument, right? You do have empirical premises, but they're the sort of empirical premises that you just can't deny. Motion exists. To deny that, I think what does Aquinas say? Something like if someone denies something just fundamental about experience like that, you might as well talk to a turnip or a carrot or something along those lines, right? What more can you say? So we have the kind of empirical sort of claim, but we also might have a conceptual or logical claim as well, right? Whatever is moved by another, right? So it's not just another empirical claim, rather it's a kind of principle that makes motion intelligible, right? In which case, then we can say, and there cannot be an infinite regress of movers, right? Otherwise, you can't explain how motion happens at all, right? We've already got the fact that motion is occurring, and we've got this conceptual claim that movement requires movement by another or change, right? So that leads us necessarily to a prime mover, something that itself does not move, but moves everything else. All right. So it's not a probabilistic sort of argument at all. Rather, it does have an empirical claim, but it has a conceptual claim, and it's meant to be a deductive argument, right? So it's a different sort of argument. It's a metaphysical kind of demonstration, right?
Yeah, but I feel like that's like a prime mover. Isn't necessarily like a god as we conceptualize. Like, it's I don't know. It's not really. Why does he care about us? You know what I mean? Like, it's not like necessarily like a god with agency. It's just like a first notion. And you could also, why couldn't there be like a cyclical, like infinite regress? You know what I mean? Like, why couldn't the universe start and collapse and go and just keep going? Like,
well, in that case, if you buy the premises, you've already stopped infinite regress at the unmoved mover. Okay, we've got motion that we have to take into account here, right? So the infinite regress, so the unmoved mover is to stop the infinite regress. And it's an infinite regress of explanation. If you don't have this, you don't have explanation, period. Right? That's the intention of the argument, at least. Whether it's successful, we're going to talk about. But nevertheless, the argument as it stands is, at least prima facie, it's rationally defensible. Now, of course, someone like Thomas, or even Aristotle, who would give this sort of argument. This isn't the whole kit and caboodle as far as the Christian God. I mean, you don't have the first mover and then you have Jesus Christ at all. And rather, it serves as a kind of preamble, right, to faith in a God of this sort, because there are certain sorts of attributes that you might be able to derive from whatever this first mover is. I mean, whatever God has to be, it has to be perfect, or else it would fail to measure up to what God should be, right? And of course, the first mover is completely actualized. And this is part of the reason why I want to be very specific about here. These arguments require a certain philosophy of nature, a certain science, we might say, in Dr. Prakash's sense. So there are certain things we will be able to say about a God of this sort, right? it's completely perfect. Perfect as in complete. Why? Because it's perfectly actualized. It's perfect act. It's not potentially anything else. There can only be one of them. Because if there were more than one, we would have to have a way of distinguishing the two. And that would require some kind of potency, right? There would be something that one of them lacked that the other had, the distinction. So there can only be one of these sorts of things, okay? So already we've got the beginnings of the kind of theism that, that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share, right? There's one God, completely perfect, and indeed on Mount Horeb, right, in Sinai. What does God reveal his name to be? Eternally self-existing being. I am. In other words, existence is here talking to you, right? But you can see how, in a preamble sort of way, right? You can establish this as a necessity here. You've already jumped to theism, and it's a rational belief that you have, right? It's rationally defensible, and then you have to decide if it's correct. On the basis of that, then you can go further down the line. Given these sorts of attributes, would this be the sort of thing that would be personal? Is it the sort of thing that would want to make itself known? All of these sorts of things. So you're not going to just get, a denomination right off the bat, but it can at least serve that purpose. Does that I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah,
right, but
I mean it helps, but it just seems that like the universe in its entirety, like the universe itself being perfect, is just as equally likely as an explanation, instead of introducing some new party, and instead of doing something outside the universe, like why can, what I mean, like wouldn't it be equally as likely that the universe itself is?
Well, it couldn't be perfect in this more technical sense, right, of being complete, because with the universe, you still have things moving from potency to act constantly, right? But the question is, does the universe itself require this sort of explanation? I mean, this is part of the intelligibility question here. This is the ultimate sort of explanation, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is whatever is set up in such a way that we can understand it? If we can ask this extra sort of question, it's not an add-on to some other kind of investigation. Rather, it's required for investigation of whatever is in general. It'd be more that kind of move. I don't know. I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but it's a start. Dave, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would just, you mentioned the possibility of an infinite cosmology of bangs and crunches or something like that. And Mr. Diebel pointed out that the traditional arguments that we associate on this count with Aristotle and St. Thomas, the rejection of an infinite regress is not a rejection of the idea that there could be an infinite sequence of temporal events. That's not the point. The point is instead, we're talking about regressive explanation. And for that, the problem is an infinite sequence of temporal events doesn't explain itself. Because then you have to ask why is there something? That's the classic way of thinking about why is there a universe, even if it's a universe that goes through an infinite series of bangs and crunches and so forth. Why is there? Or if you go to this question of intelligibility, notice the resources within nature itself are insufficient to answer those questions. And so that's the sense in which thinking about nature points to or indicates that the answers, that there are further questions that are worth asking, and indeed that a curious person who's motivated by a sense of wonder is going to be willing to ask. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to comment. Well, the three of you were in, I don't know, maybe heated agreement about something. You were circling on this issue of what is science, and I think it's sort of unfortunate that we didn't talk more about the scientific method, because I've seen a talk with Richard Dawkins where he was debating, I guess is the closest term, a theologian. And the theologian said, well, why? You're not asking why. You say you can explain the universe, what it does, but you don't ask why. And Richard Dawkins said, well, I'm not concerned with why, because I don't know a way, at the risk of misquoting him, he said something along the lines of, I don't know a way to test why. I don't know a way to set up an experiment and test why, so I'm not concerned with why. He said there are many things that 100 years ago we thought wasn't testable. We found a way to test it, and then we could answer it. Right now, it's inappropriate for me to address why, because I don't know how to test it. And so when you ask what is science, and you're talking about this, I think you called it an arbitrary distinction between philosophy and science. You say that at some point he made an arbitrary distinction that science can no longer answer these questions. Maybe that isn't arbitrary. Maybe there's a point where we say science can't go in this, can't delve into this because it's not testable. And so I think when we think about the scientific method as a definition of science, that maybe that helps sort of parse out what the difference is between science and philosophy, and maybe they're not the same. If that made any sense at all? I don't know.
No, I think it did. I'm trying to reformulate the question slightly. So I take it the question is, it's a pragmatic sort of question. How is it exactly would we, this is kind of a given the success that we have of being able to test these sorts of things, right? And the method that we've developed for testing it. How would we even go about setting up an experiment to figure out whether or not God exists? Or how would we go about testing that? Or whether the soul exists? We can take all the kind of traditional sorts of philosophical questions. And so it's not a meaningless question to ask whether or not God exists, but rather this is partially why I bring up Bickle here, right? It's not a meaningless question, but rather it's just a fruitless one. Why go around talking about it when you can't test it? Is that how you understood?
Well, yeah, and that's what I mean.
And so we have good justification for only thinking about natural sciences because of this kind of testability of them. So it's not arbitrary in one way, because we have good pragmatic justification for just thinking about it along these lines. Is that kind of the general idea?
Well, I'm also interested in this sort of, I mean, I think that there are groups that sort of separate philosophy and science, almost dichotomize them, and then there are other groups that try to say that, you know, they're the same thing. It's a pursuit of knowledge. Philosophy is science. I think that you guys were kind of dancing around that, and I'm wondering, is it so inappropriate to say that science has a method, it goes by these things, and there's certain things that are not testable outside of its method, and to call that a different thing? And is that necessarily an arbitrary distinction to say those are outside of what we've created as science, even if it is based off metaphysical assumptions? We don't even want to attempt to talk about it. Is that so arbitrary?
Well, my first reaction to that is take the discipline of mathematics. Right? There's all sorts of truths that we can know about mathematics, but nevertheless, they're not going to be the sorts of truths that we go about testing in a lab, for example. Right? So it's a rational enterprise, and we discover something true, and it's not testable in that way. Does that say that there's no reason to do it, or we should withhold judgment on whether or not we can know it? Something like that. I mean, part of the problem here is this greatly restricted idea of what we do and indeed think we can know. I mean, on the basis of this, I don't know, David, you hop in any time, but
I guess I would say we have to be careful too about thinking that scientific method is defined by testability. That's certainly a component, but when you think about, say, large-scale evolutionary theory, for example, it's not so much. What we're really back to is an attempt to explain natural phenomena by a theoretical framework. And while there are certainly points of empirical research that can help to use what Wilson would call that provide consilience. I mean, we can do research in genetic biology or in sort of comparative morphology or comparative genetics and so forth. those are going to count as, are we going to be able to produce confirming evidence? But really what we're talking about is a large-scale explanatory framework rather than a sort of simplistic idea of you have a theory and you go in the lab and you test it. That way of thinking about science seems to me, well, misleadingly simplistic as a way of characterizing what science does. The other point to bring out here is, Dr. Tkach has already mentioned that we do distinguish scientific disciplines by their subject matter. Mathematical objects, that's an appropriate way of talking about one area of knowing. Living things is another area of knowing, and so forth. So there are lines that we can draw between disciplines. The objection that we were making in various ways about this idea of truncation is that, well, one way of putting it, to go back to Dawkins, is that Dawkins has a very narrow conception of what can be explained, and he insists that anything that can't be explained within that narrow conception of explanation is unexplainable or uninteresting or not worth pursuing. It seems to me is what he's really arguing. And so, I mean, you could say, well, wait, the methods of inquiry in evolutionary biology are different from those in theoretical physics, which are different from those in theoretical mathematics. Now, there's some overlap between those, but they're different because the subject matters are different. And we need a conception of knowing that allows for all of those spheres of different objects that we want to study, and the appropriate modifications of method that are going to be used in each of those individual disciplines.
I guess one last thing that I would say then is, why is it then that people seem to really want this sort of modern scientific proof of God? I mean, not everyone, but it seems like people are always asking that. Can we prove God exists? Or they're looking for proofs, they're looking for evidence of that. Why is it then that we've held the scientific method and the scientific reductive testability? Why have we held that above everything else? Or do you think that's inappropriate?
Well, you're asking for, that's almost like a psychological, cultural question. Why do we like this? And I think, well, I mean, I suggested one possible line of answer to that question in my opening comments, where I think that many people are so taken by the power and success of modern natural science that they find it difficult to conceive of a broader conception of what we are able to know. And that may be, I mean, maybe in some cases, I suppose, we're talking about psychological explanation. It can be all over the map. In some cases, it's a failure of imagination. In some cases, Dr. Tkach has already suggested, in some cases like Dawkins, it's a prejudice, right? If you don't play the game the way I think it should be played, then you aren't really finding knowledge at all. That's just a prejudice, it seems to me. In the back there, yeah.
It seems like if you say there is no God, then the universe must be a purely random operation. And so all you have left is statistics and probability as to how things have happened. Because when you would look at the true mathematical odds that certain things would happen, say like evolution, and I've seen calculations like that unless that under just purely random happenings, the odds that things would happen a certain way are, 1 to the negative 100 power or something. And so you have a faith that the universe is without a God, or a faith that there is a God. And so either way, the proof is in the eye of the beholder. It's not. It's depending on what your prejudice is, because you don't have a mathematical solid proof, even if you deny God.
I'd say that's a view people have, but it's a version of what is typically called fideism, which is, at root, we don't have reasons for what we believe. Instead, they're sort of like fundamental faith commitments. And I think, actually, if we ask questions like, why is the universe intelligible, it's not just a matter of you, I don't think it's just a matter of you close your eyes and take a pick, or you go with the prejudice that you already have. I would say we don't, I would argue that we shouldn't, at least at that point even, abandon the question of, do we have reasonable principles of explanation here? And so that's why a kind of traditional cosmological argument is still at least a potential pathway for answering or addressing the question.
Plus, it's going to affect also, if you take the traditional cosmological way, it's going to affect the way that you understand nature's relationship to God itself, or God himself, in that way. So that you might, to talk about it in these terms might be just problematic in and of themselves. Where something like deism, right? God winds up the clock and lets it go. Those are actually, that view of the world's relationship to God is just going to be rendered problematic when we're talking about intelligibility and this sort of thing. First mover proofs would not allow for that view of God at all, right? Because God is a sustaining creator. Because creation here is understood as ontological dependence on something, not merely a kind of winding up and letting go. So, I mean, there are different avenues of understanding exactly how this kind of proof would work and what it would actually say about God's relationship to the world and that sort of thing.
Well, the deism example actually helpfully shows that it's not merely a faith commitment about whether you pick deism or traditional theism or atheism, but we should consider what the arguments are. Is there a reason to reject deism as a possible explanation for the origination of the cosmos? You also in the back, you had your hand up too.
Can I ask what you mean by intelligible? Like, how would you characterize the word intelligible? Because I think that has a lot of weight in terms of all three of ours.
Did you want to take it?
Oh, I don't care, yeah, sure. I mean it pretty straightforwardly, able to be explained by modes of rational, by offering rational accounts.
So does that mean what is intelligible at one point is always intelligible from then on? Because if you can accept the fact that you may not have continuity in terms of what is true, and you may only have a chance of something being true at a certain point. Well, then I think you can kind of extend yourself outside of I guess the realm of either atheism or theism in order to explain things. But if you do assume that what is true always, or must be true, then I think both sides make that assumption, and pretty perilously so. I think that you could say people assume that they are able to know something when they do not. But then you have to ask why. Why would you even ask the question in the first place? Good. Sorry, it's just a different.
Well, I'm not sure I understand. If you mean things change, and sometimes our explanations of things change, I mean, my initial response to your question is if you say, if you have an explanation that's true, and then it's not true, that would be to say things changed, and so we would want an explanation for why they've changed. That is assuming the change is itself intelligible. So I'm not sure. If you're asking something different, I suppose I would say the fact that things change is one of the things that we explain. And so if things change, I mean, to say that the universe is intelligible is not to say, it's not to simply say, at one moment I know all the details about the cosmos, but that's for one fleeting second. No, it's to say we have an approach to asking and answering questions about explanation. I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about.
Yeah,
though.
so I guess hopefully this will make it a little bit clearer. It's pretty abstract. The idea is, well, we can't really know anything with certainty. If we don't even know the origin of, if we don't know with certainty the origin of the universe or the origin of matter or the origin of energy, but we can assume, we can make certain assumptions just knowing that uncertainty exists. And from there, that's where we establish these sort of foundations of knowledge. So think that science does a better job of explaining things with certainty, or at least getting further away from the degree of uncertainty. Like if we're trying to really optimize that, then the possibility of assuming that something can and always will be true.
No, I think you're confused. I think this rests on a sort of confusion that you've got. I think I know what you mean, and what you mean to say and what you're actually saying are not quite the same thing, I think. Okay. Certainly, if you want to get at something more than the idea that facts of the matter change, or that our explanations of facts of the matter change, right? Certainly that's true, but again, not a particularly interesting matter to people except for, I don't know, Armenians and so on. Most of us will acknowledge that, and as a matter of fact, it's built into science. But if you talk about the natural sciences and certainty, you're talking about the wrong sort of criteria, right? Because they don't produce certainty in that way. So I find that the language confusing. I think a lot of people are getting confused about the language. So is what you really want to say really is that the empirical sciences are more successful.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, when we talk about certainty, we're talking about a degree of success that's confusing matters because that's looking at a very different sort of realm than the empirical science too, I think too, a lot of times. So if you just, so I take it your first point is being the success of science. Yeah, sure. Okay, but what I also think is very subclear in there, do you want to deny the idea that the success of science, of the empirical sciences, rests on a sort of more fundamental, or if you use the word more fundamental, so a more fundamental type of knowledge. Is that what you're trying to, and I'm not sure when you're trying to put that forth or to deny it.
I'm trying to deny it. I think that's probably, like I said, is perilous for me.
So you think we only have probabilistic knowledge?
Yes.
Okay. So, so mathematics is not probabilistic
Well,
in any way. It's just isn't. So would you deny mathematical knowledge? Would you deny logical proof?
it depends on what area of mathematics. I mean, there are things that we have attempted to explain in terms of continuity that are literally not always true. I mean, you think about the way that information taught mechanics at the school. In the beginning, mechanics and materials, you have essentially integrals and derivatives, but really, that's not.
But yes, but to say that there are fields or areas of mathematics that are probabilistic is not to answer the question of whether non-probabilistic knowledge is possible. If you, for example, use logic, we can research. I mean, the law of non-contradiction is not going to up and change.
Right, that's true.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to parse out a little more what you're doing. Okay, fair enough. But I think we were talking about cross purposes on it.
We are almost out of time. Rick, you had your hand up. We'll let you ask one more question here then.
I'll just defend Dawkins for a second.
Okay.
Well,
Sounds like fun.
it's not that interesting, but I happen to think that the natural sciences constitute the best enterprise for knowledge acquisition, which is bona fide knowledge of the world. How can I put this? So I think Dawkins shares that idea. Is there a principal problem with just saying, well, at the moment, given the natural sciences, we don't have a solid understanding understanding, this knowledge sort of way, this bona fide knowledge kind of way of the origins of the universe. But we're getting there. We have a set of theories that are confirmed in different ways, right? And we're still in the process of seeing how well they predict other phenomena and that kind of thing. And the good thing about them is that they're testable. And in fact, we have the Large Hadron Collider looking for that elusive Higgs boson. Is there a principal problem with just having a provisional attitude about so-called philosophical questions? No. We're working on it. We're working on these questions, and why not just wait? Why make that sort of immediate leap? The prime mover, which is some kind of an act, has to be this God. Why make that kind of commitment? Why, at the risk of committing myself to some entity of that kind, this metaphysical, almost extravagant entity to commit yourself to, why not just commit myself to something that seems a little bit more tangible, something that I could explain? You know what I mean?
I dare say that multiverse isn't terribly tangible. But okay, so let's grant that. The fact that you're still in the business of explanation, right? Even if you have this kind of provisional attitude toward it, let's say this is the best game in town. I think we can spell out a story about explanation, change, these sorts of things, that we don't necessarily have to have quite a provisional attitude toward. Right? There are certain sorts of principles that we're going to be using, even to break out the bosons and ram things together and all these sorts of things. Right? The fact that we expect certain sorts of effects to follow on certain sorts of causes, even if we're not going to be Humean about the whole project. Heck, we could ram two atoms together and it'd turn into a unicorn, for all we know. If we're not going to go that direction, I think it lends itself very naturally to the fact that we're back to the question of intelligibility, even with this kind of provisional attitude toward it. I don't know if that got us there, but I like to think of it in terms of kind of in phenomenological language here. There's a sense in which the world is disclosed to us, right? So we can have a kind of provisional attitude, but we're finding out the way the world really is. And it might be slow going, and the world might appear in multitudinous ways. But I don't think that the jump to the metaphysical claim is quite as scary, spooky as it really seems. I mean, we've got explanations. How are explanations themselves even possible?
For the naturalist, it's certainly spooky.
What's that?
For the naturalist, it's certainly spooky, this notion of a prime mover. We have ways to explain things that are not at that level of generality, which is dealing with concepts, medieval concepts, the level of secondary inventions. Why don't we just look at stuff and kind of, just the way that fits in with all the theories we already have. There's a web of beliefs that we're already invested in.
But that's to make, again, that move of arbitrary truncation and just to say, well, we're not going to ask any questions about those matters anymore. We can do that, right? We can say, that sounds spooky to us, we don't want to talk about it, but that's an arbitrary truncation. To go back to Aristotle and the idea of wonder, is to simply say, oops, no wonder allowed there, stop wondering, don't do that. Or postpone your wonder, you can wonder later when we've got more theories in hand to deal with that. And you can do that. I mean, that's certainly Dawkins' approach. But there's also grounds to criticize him and say that's an arbitrary place to draw the line and say we wonder about this stuff, but we're not allowed to, or we're not going to start wondering about that stuff.
And that's actually part of the reason why I brought up Diebel in this case, in terms of a decompositional kind of analysis. When Winsett talks about it in terms of these kinds of rules of thumb for analysis, the idea is to make problems manageable. respects. But this goes back to the question of lumber. Just because you made the problem manageable and maybe truncated doesn't mean that we have to make the additional step that's the only way that we can look at this, and we shouldn't look at it any other way, or investigate something slightly more basic than this.
Well, we're a little over time. Thanks for coming. Glad you came. If you would like to have our